The sea has always had a strong attraction for mankind. It not only offers a source of food, but also the possibility to explore the world and set up new trade routes. But it wasn't long before the sea became the scene of many a bloody battle. Back in ancient times, the Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians and Romans were often engaged in sea battles in which their ships, fitted with rams and boarding bridges, attempted to board or destroy their opponents' vessels. It was in the 8th century AD that the Vikings, or Norsemen as they were also called, began to raid northern and western Europe by sea, up until the 11th century. It's also possible that these excellent seafarers also discovered the North American continent long before Columbus. The Hansa League, a medieval guild of German merchants in various coastal towns, managed to achieve a great deal of power and position with its courageous seafarers. But the increasing wealth and dominance of the League was a cause of jealousy for many of the League's opponents and led to trade wars and even piracy during the following centuries. The great seafaring nations like Spain, France and England used the seas for their own expansive aims. In 1588, the mighty Spanish Armada was destroyed by the English fleet. Then there was the famous Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, in which Admiral Lord Nelson struck a devastating blow to a major French fleet and dashed Napoleon's dreams of dominating the seas forever. The Navy in Germany tended to play only a minor role up until the middle of the 19th century. The country, which was split up into a number of small principalities, could not afford a fleet of its own. But there were a number of armed vessels in existence which were used to combat piracy. Even Frederick the Great used little enthusiasm for shipbuilding. Because wood was an important export item, he ordered each piece of wood should be utilized and the best possible price attained. It was in 1848 that revolution was sparked off in Germany. General von Rodowitz, speaking in the National Assembly, demanded the building of a fleet for the future German Reich. It was the first sign of a German wish to fly its black, red and gold flag alongside the other great seafaring nations. The 29th of April 1848 saw Denmark declare war on the North German states and annex Schleswig. This prompted Germany to buy ships from England. But there was no way that this could be described as independent naval policy. The only battle at sea took place in 1849 off Helgoland, and the German vessels were under the command of Admiral Bromé. A short exchange of fire took place between the Danes and the Germans, which was of little military significance. The German Revolution failed. The 10th of April 1852 saw the German flag lowered on board the Barbarossa, which was Admiral Bromley's flagship. He later handed his vessel over to the Prussian Navy. The rest of the fleet was sold or auctioned off. Even a strong military power like Prussia had only a small fleet. This policy changed following a victory over Austria. Bismarck launched an initiative which created a North German Confederation in 1866, which decided to strengthen the fleets. Although a number of large warships were bought abroad, the new naval force was too weak to play an important part in the Franco-German War in 1870 and 71. The German Reich was founded in 1871, but the German naval force had little significance when compared with the land-based forces. Just the same, ships were now being built in German shipyards, and companies like the Krupp concern got involved in the lucrative fleet construction business. Emperor William II came to power in 1888, and he was a monarch who saw the future of his country firmly connected with the sea. German colonies had been created from trading posts and foreign stations which could only be reached by sea and thus had to be protected. The Navy experienced a boost in its importance. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, State Secretary in the Naval Ministry, introduced a new law in 1898 which ordered the building up of a fleet which would be capable of taking part in a military offensive. Battle cruisers and heavy armed ships of the line were constructed at incredible cost, and it wasn't long before Germany had a convincing battle fleet. It was around about this time that a young naval officer by the name of Eberhard von Manthey worked out a plan for an attack on the east coast of America. It contained detailed information about targets for artillery bombardments and possible places to land. This plan is of historical importance because it proves that a conflict with America, and not just with Great Britain, the leading sea power at the time, was possible even before the turn of the century. This plan fitted in well with the ambitious fleet thinking of the later Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, whose declared aim it was to make Germany the second strongest sea power in the world. The beginning of the 20th century saw the alliance between Germany, Italy and Austria-Hungary against France and Russia begin to crumble. Italy set up closer ties with France, which was allied with Russia. Great Britain became allied with France and also had ties with Russia. The reason for this new political reshuffle was the growing competition between imperialistic England and Germany, which was growing in an economic importance. The situation became volatile, and it only needed a spark to set it off. On the eve of the First World War, Germany had a large naval fleet consisting of 14 modern ships of the line, 4 battle cruisers and 7 new armoured cruisers. Out of a total of 44 submarines, only 5 were equipped with modern diesel engines. The others had petrol engines and were only of limited use in a war at sea. Unaware of the true military significance of the submarines, the German High Command only used them for reconnaissance missions in the beginning. It was only when Captain Henningsen of U-boat No. 9 sank 3 English battleships in one day, on the 22nd of September 1914, that the powers realised the importance of submarines. Henningsen was later greeted as a hero by the German population and was awarded the Pour leur Mérite medal, the highest Prussian award, from the hand of the Kaiser himself. It was on the 7th of May 1915 that the Germany U-20 submarine sank the English passenger vessel, the Lusitania. The passengers who lost their lives included some citizens of a neutral country, America in this case. The Lusitania affair has gone down in history because the vessel was carrying military equipment and ammunition bound for England. The German embassy in the United States had placed advertisements in American papers warning people not to travel as passengers because of the risk of being torpedoed. The British authorities advised the vessel to leave its scheduled route, and it ended up in the operational area of the U-20. The British knew that the ship's course took in through an area where a German U-boat had sunk a number of British ships a few days previously. At this point in time, the German side was working on the basis that a strong concentration of submarines off the coast would cut England off from the badly needed supplies of food and military equipment and eventually force the country to its knees. In actual fact, the extent of British losses at the beginning appeared to support the German High Command's tactics. But once the British had reacted to the situation, introduced the convoy system and put submarine hunters into service, the number of ships lost was drastically reduced. The end of February 1916 saw the Germans introduce tougher submarine warfare, and this included armed merchant ships from neutral countries supplying Britain with goods. They were treated like hostile warships and attacked without warning. The British, for their part, began to weaken the German Reich by means of a sea blockade, which had military and economic effects. An attempt by Germany to return to the internationally recognized laws of the sea fell on deaf ears in Great Britain. When England adamantly refused to raise the blockade, Germany declared unlimited submarine warfare on the 1st of February 1917. German submarines attacked unarmed merchant ships from neutral nations if they were within certain areas. Outside these areas specified by Germany, foreign ships were stopped and eventually sunk by artillery fire after the crews had taken to the lifeboats. Seen politically, this unlimited submarine warfare soon represented a political catastrophe for Germany because it only speeded up America's entry into the First World War. The Americans had declared their neutrality at the beginning of the war, but their ships had supplied Britain continually with war supplies. The sinking of American ships eventually saw Congress officially declare war on Germany on the 2nd of April 1917. The Americans had found an excuse to attain their imperialistic aims in a military way. It was the First World War, above all, which helped America as a victorious power to play a decisive role in the New World Order. From this point on, the US's combined industrial and financial power became beneficial to Washington's allies. The US economy, which had been going through a period of stagnation, began to boom because of the war effort, and export figures rose by 300%. The German Reich had little chance against this material superiority, and the outcome of the war was more or less determined. During the course of the war, the German Navy carried out a growing number of logistical tasks, including the transportation of large numbers of ground forces to distant fronts. Film footage of troop transportation near a place called Ösel gave an insight into this phase of the First World War. Apart from a number of minor skirmishes near Helgoland and the Dogger Bank, the Battle of Jutland certainly gained an important place in the history of the war. The 31st of May 1916 saw the German fleet, consisting of 112 ships, leave their naval base in Wilhelmshaven to attack a group of British cruisers in the North Sea. After being warned by air reconnaissance, the main British fleet, consisting of 150 warships, left Scapa Flow in the Orkneys on the same day to confront the German fleet off the Danish coast. Neither the German nor the British side had any idea about the actual military strength of their opponents. During the course of the afternoon, the British cruiser Galatea, stationed on the right wing of the fleet, came across the German Elbing, together with their respective torpedo boats. A short engagement followed. The Germans are said to have inflicted a lot of damage to their opponents, but the arrival of the British main fleet put the Germans in a precarious position. The German forces, consisting of 16 large naval vessels, began a major attack on the British force with its 28 large warships. The idea was to prevent the British from taking up better tactical battle positions, but the British force was too strong, forcing the Germans to retreat under the cover of darkness 12 hours later, pass through British lines, and seek refuge in the safe North Sea port. The Germans later claimed success in the battle, saying their fleet, consisting of 115,000 tons, had managed to sink twice as much enemy tonnage. The German side lost the Lutzow battleship, the Pommern, a ship of the line, 4 cruisers, the Wiesbaden, Rostock, Elbing and Frauenlob, as well as 5 torpedo boats. The total number of German servicemen who lost their lives was 2,551, compared with 6,094 on the British side. In the final analysis, no side really turned out victorious in the Battle of Jutland. The outcome was indecisive. The Germans believed victory had been on their side because of the losses suffered by the British. The British saw the affair as advantageous because of a foiled attempt to break through the sea blockade, which later contributed to Germany's eventual defeat in the First World War. Following the Battle of Jutland, things became quiet around the German fleet. The ships lay at anchor off Wilhelmshaven and never ventured out to sea again. The Germans had control of the waters of the Baltic, but it was only mine sweepers, the submarines and torpedo boats, that sailed out into the heavily mined waters of the North Sea. It was the demoralizing lack of activity, and above all the harsh conditions on board, that eventually led to the mutiny among the crews. A mutiny on board the Prinz Regent Luitpold and the Friedrich der Große in Wilhelmshaven in 1917 saw the German Navy see this as a stab in the back for the German fighting forces, right up until the end of 1945. The naval personnel were quickly brought under control and their leaders sentenced to death. At this point in the war, large sections of the armed forces and the civilian population were suffering war weariness, because the army was fighting a losing battle and starvation was rife on the home front. When capitulation became inevitable, the Kaiser abdicated and Philipp Scheidemann, a social democrat, announced the founding of a free German republic from the balcony of the Reichstag building in Berlin. A ceasefire was finally signed in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest with the victorious French Marshal Foch on the 11th of November 1918. This was later followed by the Versailles Agreement in June 1919, which was designed to lay down conditions for peace. In actual fact, the conditions of the agreement only created the basis for another war. The demands of the victorious powers centered not only on reparations, but also laid down that large areas of land should change hands, even though the resident German people were opposed to the idea. Important branches of industry were dismantled and removed. Discontent grew. The German Navy, which had managed to develop into a major sea power in the last decades and was only second to Britain at the start of the First World War, saw the tough conditions laid down by the victorious powers as the end of their achievements. Even the ceasefire agreement of November 1918 demanded that 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 8 light cruisers, 50 new destroyers and all submarines should be disarmed and held in neutral or former enemy ports. It was something that had never been seen in the history of the sea. The result of all this later meant that 70 of the largest and most modern German warships lay at anchor in the Bay of Scapa Flow. In an attempt to prevent the British gaining the ships as spoils of war, the German fleet commander Rear Admiral von Reuter ordered the sea cocks to be opened and the German flags hoisted. The ships were scuttled and sank on the 21st of June 1919. The British opened fire on the Germans leaving in lifeboats and killed and wounded 4 officers and 24 sailors. The German merchant navy and the civilian population were hit even harder by the reparations demands and the blockade policies carried out by the Allies. Hundreds and hundreds of Germans, above all women and children, died at the end of the war from starvation and disease. Access to world markets was blocked. Goods on board merchant ships, a quarter of the fishing fleet, and all ships that were currently under construction were confiscated. The German percentage of the world's merchant fleet sank from over 11% in 1914 down to 0.2% in 1920. German willingness to sign a ceasefire agreement was based in part on the contents of a speech made by US President Woodrow Wilson on the 8th of January 1918. His 14-point program included complete freedom for shipping in war and peace outside territorial waters. The reality of the situation was much different. The declared aim of the victors, and the British in particular, was to destroy Germany's maritime competence. The effects can even be felt today. At the end of the war, the Germans were faced with the question of whether to dissolve the German Navy altogether or put the few ships that remained under the control of the Armed Forces Command. Then, on the 23rd of March 1921, the Reichstag, or German Parliament, passed a new defence law which included new guidelines for the German Navy. The flag of the new Reichsmarine was hoisted for the first time on April 1st in the same year. As early as the 1st of January 1922, the black, red and white flag with the Iron Cross in the middle and the black, red, gold flag were hoisted on all ships and shore establishment of the German Navy. But the reconstruction of the Navy only moved ahead at a snail's pace. As the Emden, a small cruiser, was launched on the 7th of January 1925 in Wilhelmshaven, it meant that the first big ship had been completed since the end of the First World War. Navy Day 1928. Veterans and active Navy personnel gather in Berlin to honour the memory of the German submariners who lost their lives in the First World War. Rear Admiral Pühlen welcomes the participants. The gathering ended with a procession through Berlin. The large amount of interest generated by the people of Berlin was proof of the high standing that the German Navy enjoyed. The 1st of October sees Admiral Erich Raeder take over command of the German Navy. A large number of light cruisers are put into service during his period of leadership. The 19th of May 1931 sees the launching of the warship Deutschland, which was later renamed the Lützow. People begin to enjoy peacetime after the strenuous years of war. In 1929, a liner called the Bremen is launched and later embarks on a transatlantic voyage to the United States. The passengers enjoy the trip and take advantage of the facilities on board. Travel to far-off continents and foreign countries is now possible. No destination, however far away, can be reached by means of modern passenger liners. As Paul von Hindenburg, the president of the German Reich, instates Adolf Hitler as German Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933 and the Nazi Party takes over power in Germany, rearmament begins to move forward. The German Navy also benefits from the economic and military upswing taking place in the country. Admiral Erich Raeder, the Supreme Navy Commander since 1935, places particular emphasis on building up the U-boat fleet. Because all this was in strict contravention of the Versailles Agreement, the necessary machines and equipment for 12,250-ton vessels were manufactured under a cloak of secrecy and stored in Kiel. At the same time, shipyard construction capacity for another 6 submarines of this class was arranged. March 1935 sees the German government declaring the military restrictions contained at the Versailles Agreement as null and void and introduces compulsory military service. Within a few weeks, the first 12 U-boats are put into service. 3 complete submarine flotillas are in service with the German Navy by 1937. It wasn't just the newly formed German Wehrmacht that experienced its baptism of fire when involved in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. The Navy was involved as well. 2 warships, the Deutschland and the Admiral Scheer, were sent to Spain to pick up German nationals and other refugees from the areas where fighting was taking place. During this mission, the Deutschland was hit by a bomb dropped by a Republican plane, and the German Navy had its first casualties. Spring 1939 saw Erich Raeder, who had recently been promoted to Admiral of the Fleet, gain Hitler's support for a large-scale construction program that he called the Z-Plan. The program was designed to take 5 to 6 years to complete. At its completion, the German Navy should consist of 10 large battleships, 15 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 49 cruisers, 158 destroyers and torpedo boats, 75 fast torpedo boats, 227 minesweepers and clearance vessels, as well as 249 submarines. But the events that took place at the latter date put paid to these ambitious plans. Germany and Japan signed the so-called Anti-Comintern Pact on the 25th of November 1936, and Italy's Mussolini joins as well in 1937. The axis with Berlin, Rome and Tokyo comes into being. Europe is still enjoying peace, but forthcoming conflicts soon begin to cast a shadow. A naval bombardment by the German Schleswig-Holstein near Danzig on the 1st of September 1939 heralded the start of the Second World War. Hitler launches an all-out attack on Poland in the early hours of the morning. But the German Navy only plays a subordinate role in the future course of the campaign. France and Great Britain had signed defence guarantees with Poland. Both countries declare war on Germany on the 3rd of September. Although the Soviet forces march into Poland a few days later, no further declarations of war are forthcoming. Once again, German submarines were on the prowl. The 14th of October saw the commander of the U-47, Captain Günther Prien, start out an extremely dangerous mission which later earned him the nickname of the Steer of Scapa Flow. Hitler had ordered Prien to take his submarine in the direction of the Orkney Islands north of Scotland. During the hours of darkness, the prevailing currents took the submarine into Scapa Flow, which had the reputation of being a safe haven for British warships. The U-47 later torpedoed the battleship Royal Oak, and the torpedo hit the ammunition store. The ship exploded, and 883 personnel lost their lives. The U-47 just managed to get out of Scapa Flow under a hail of depth charges and bombs. It arrived back in Kiel on the 17th of October, where it was met by Admiral Dönitz and Grand Admiral Raeder in person. Prien was later decorated by Hitler with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross and was acclaimed a hero by the Nazi war propaganda machine. The end of September 1939 saw two German battleships, the Deutschland and the Admiral Graf Spee pocket battleship, get their sailing orders to attack merchant shipping. The Deutschland only managed to sink a British steamer and two neutral ships, but the Admiral Graf Spee was more successful. Captain Hans Langsdorff was able to destroy 9 enemy merchant ships on his voyage to Montevideo, where he had information that 4 British merchant ships were preparing to leave. On the 13th of December, the Graf Spee came up against a number of smaller British cruisers at the mouth of the River Plate. A number of British ships were badly damaged, and the Graf Spee had to put into Montevideo, a neutral port, for repairs. The British government put pressure on Uruguay to limit the German battleship's stay to 72 hours. The time was too short to carry out the necessary repairs. The British called up reinforcements. Langsdorff felt his position was hopeless because, he said, he hadn't enough ammunition for an extended sea battle. After contact with the German High Command, he put to sea on the 17th of December with only 40 members of crew on board and scuttled the pocket battleship in full view of thousands of spectators on land before the remaining British warships could engage the German vessel again. Langsdorff and his remaining crew left the ship and were interned by the Uruguay government. The German captain later committed suicide. Although Grand Admiral Raeder had often expressed the wish to occupy Norway, Hitler remained firm on preserving Scandinavian neutrality. But when German intelligence reports revealed that the British were preparing for a landing in Norway, Hitler changed his mind, accepted invasion plans, and set the 9th of April as the day. Within a few hours, preparations for the biggest landing by the Wehrmacht in the entire Second World War got underway. 11 German warships, supported by airborne and Alpine units, began their race against time with the British. The whole thing was given the code name Weserübung. The operative brain behind the whole landing was Erich Raeder. His plan was based on a study carried out by Vice Admiral Wegener in 1926, who had advised in favour of the occupation of Norway and North France should war break out between Germany and Great Britain. April 9, 1940. The Wehrmacht issued a statement saying the German forces had taken over the armed protection of Norway to preserve the country's neutrality in the face of a British invasion. Only one day previously, British warships had begun to lay mines in Norwegian territorial waters in the north. It was a welcome opportunity for Hitler to use the situation to justify his own invasion plans. During the early hours of the morning, German ships moved into Norwegian waters and landed troops in Korsør and Nyborg. This operation against Norway was the first joint operation involving the Army, the Navy and Air Force, but did not involve a joint supreme commander. Operation Weserübung demanded a high price from the German side. In the battle for Narvik, the destroyer group suffered serious losses, and the brand new heavy cruiser Blücher sank in the Oslo fjord. Today, we're aware that the German invasion of Norway took place only a few hours before the British moved in. The German success in Norway led to a government crisis in London, and the new Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. The invasion in Northern Europe was hardly finished before the German forces began to move on the Western Front. Within a few days, German tank spearheads had reached the Channel coast and encircled the British expeditionary force and parts of the French and Belgian forces around Dunkirk. Hitler ordered the German advance stop on the 24th of May because he feared a French counter-offensive on his flank, which was exposed due to the rapid rate of advance. The British seized the opportunity to lift 340,000 troops off the beaches within a few days, using every available ship together, big or small, with 120,000 French soldiers. The 14th of June saw German troops enter Paris. 8 days later, the French government capitulated. Hitler refused to allow any kind of victory parade in the French capital, so not as to hurt French feelings. Only a march past by the victorious German units with their commander taking the salute was allowed. The ceasefire laid down that northern France should be occupied and the southern part of the country should remain free. The new government was headed by Marshal Pétain, the defender of Verdun. Great Admiral Raeder asked Hitler whether Germany could claim the French fleet as the spoils of war, but Hitler refused, saying the fleet had not been defeated and could not be claimed. Some of the ships were disarmed, and Pétain was allowed to retain the rest to control French interests in the North African colonies. Pétain moved the large part of the French fleet to Mers el Kabir in Algeria. On the 3rd of June 1940, a British fleet turned up with the Hood, Valiant and Resolution battleships, as well as the Ark Royal aircraft carrier and a number of other units under the command of Vice Admiral Somerville. The British ordered the French to hand the ships over. They said they didn't want them to fall into German hands. When the French refused, the British opened fire and sank the main part of the fleet. The French did fight back, but the British had the upper hand. Only the battleship named the Strasbourg managed to escape. The French side suffered 1,700 deaths and a further 400 were injured. In view of the lightning success in Poland, France, Belgium and the Netherlands, Admiral Raeder began to press Hitler to take up more active policies in the Mediterranean area. He demanded war against the main opponent, meaning Britain, and even called for the occupation of Greece in March 1941. But Hitler was still hesitant. Parallel to the military advances in Western and Northern Europe, German U-boats were also beginning their war against merchant shipping. Although the Allies had only used submarines in individual cases, the Germans had waged organised submarine warfare from the very beginning. The main German targets were Allied transport vessels. In retrospect, there were three main phases in the German U-boat war. The first phase, the so-called Golden Period from June 1940 to May 1941. During this period, the Germans managed to sink a total of 2,591,000 gross registered tons of enemy shipping west of England. The second phase, the so-called Second Golden Period from February to October 1942, when German submarines destroyed around 1 million gross registered tons of shipping in American waters. And the third phase during the times of attacks on convoys in the Atlantic in spring 1943. At this time, the Germans managed to destroy around 620,000 gross registered tons of shipping. It's important in this context to examine the numbers of German submarines on operational duties. This provides more information about the developments taking place in the war than the simple figures on shipping destroyed. During the first phase, there were never more than 20 U-boats in operation at the same time. During the second phase, this figure jumped to 50. During the battles around the Atlantic convoys, there were often more than 100 submarines in action. These are figures that illustrate that the German submarines found it ever more difficult during the course of the war to sink enemy vessels. Although they had managed some spectacular successes at times, the Grey Wolves had serious problems to cope with. It was the torpedoes that badly needed more development work. In November 1939, a German U-boat fired 3 torpedoes at the Nelson battleship. All 3 were hits, but none actually exploded. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was actually on board the Nelson at the time. What effects could his death have had on the British leadership? One can only speculate. Incidents like this occurred on a number of occasions. During the occupation of Norway, German submarines fired no less than 5 torpedoes at the Warspit on the Oslo fjord, and none of them exploded. The number of dud torpedoes at this time lay around 50%. The middle of 1940 saw the beginning of intensified submarine warfare. In spite of new tactics used during attack and technical advances, the German U-boats suffered heavy losses. The loss of experienced submarine commanders and well-trained crews was hard to even out. In 1941 alone, the Germans lost 2 of their most experienced and successful submarine commanders, Günther Prien and Joachim Schwepke. Often officers from the second generation had to move up into the position of captain to close the gaps. A decisive factor in the submarine war centered on the Enigma cipher machine that was used for encoding the daily radio messages. The German side was convinced that the complicated codes could not be cracked. Working on the basis of knowledge from Polish scientists, the British were able to decode parts of the secret messages from the middle of 1941 onwards. The seizing of the German U-110 and a modern Enigma cipher machine meant the German codes were no longer a problem. Allied specialists quickly learnt how to read the orders from the German High Command and work out German submarine positions. It was the beginning of the end of the German U-boats as a successful weapon of war. As German troops advanced on the Eastern Front, the German Reich was faced with a new enemy, the United States of America. Following the surprise attack by the Japanese on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy also declared war on America because they were allied with Japan. Today it's alleged that the American president knew about the Japanese plans in advance and accepted the deaths of thousands of GIs in order to create public resentment and allow the US to enter the war. Just like in the First World War, the US government had announced a declaration of neutrality at the beginning of the Second World War. Just like in 1914, economic interests overcame moral objections, and weapons were sold on a cash and carry basis. Payment on delivery. The American economy flourished. In spite of ever more cases of US neutrality being ignored, Dönitz ordered the U-boat commanders to avoid any incidents involving the US over the next few weeks. They were to follow this no matter what the case. From now on, attacks should only be launched on cruisers, battleships and aircraft carriers, and only if they were hostile. Warships travelling blacked out did not necessarily mean they were hostile. A little while later, Washington began to show its true face. America supplied Britain with 50 destroyers designed for submarine hunting in exchange for bases on British islands in the Atlantic. The situation began to escalate. From then on, the US Navy informed London about the exact position of German and Italian ships in the Western Atlantic. American merchant ships were allowed to be armed, and warships were given the order to attack any German or Italian warship in waters that were important for American defense. Germany's later declaration of war on the United States turned out to be a mere act of formality in view of the reality of things. The beginning of January 1942 saw Operation Drumbeat begin. It involved the use of German submarines off the east coast of the United States. Although only 5 U-boats were in action in the beginning, the results were astounding. At the end of the month, some 31 vessels had been destroyed on the coast and 49 others sunk in the Atlantic. The introduction of a tanker as a kind of U-boat mothership, which could supply and refuel German submarines at sea, extended the operational capabilities enormously. At the end of the first 6 months in 1942, a total of 495 ships had been sunk off the American coast, with the loss of only 12 German U-boats. On the 12th of September 1942, Captain Werner Hartenstein on board the U-156 sighted the British vessel Laconia off the African coast. The ship had been turned into an armed vessel for troop transportation purposes. The vessel had 14 guns and was equipped with depth charges. The Laconia, which was on a voyage from Suez to England, was carrying hundreds of British passengers, including large numbers of women and children, as well as 1,800 Italian troops who had been captured at El Amman. They were guarded by Polish soldiers. At 22:07, the order to fire was given on board the U-156. Hartenstein moved his U-boat closer as the vessel with its 19,695 gross registered tons began to sink in order to pick up the people. As the first person was pulled on board, the captain not only learnt how many people were actually on board, but also that the Polish soldiers guarding the Italians were refusing to open the prisoners' pens and had even fired shots at Italians attempting to get out through a porthole. Captain Hartenstein radioed a message to Admiral Dönitz, explained the situation and asked for further orders. The German submarine leadership then ordered all U-boats in the area to make their way to the scene. Germany also asked the Vichy government to send French ships lying in Dakar to help the situation and support rescue attempts. 6 German U-boats in the area broke off operations and set sail for Laconia's. 6 German U-boats in the area broke off operations and set sail for the Laconia's position. It was something that had never happened before in the history of this sea. Hartenstein himself also appealed for further help in a radio message in English. The U-506 and the U-507 had already taken large numbers of shipwrecked people on board when an American Liberator bomber approached the scene. Hartenstein, who had spread out a Red Cross flag on his vessel for safety reasons, flashed a Morse code message with lamps saying, "German submarine with shipwrecked people on board. Have you seen any ships in the vicinity?" Having had no response, a Royal Air Force officer on board sent a Morse code message explaining there were survivors from the Laconia on board. The bomber flew away in a circle and then attacked minutes later. Bombs landed between lifeboats, caused one to overturn and killed a number of shipwrecked people. The bomber then turned away, but later flew back and dropped 2 further bombs, which damaged the U-156. Hartenstein then asked the rescued people to leave his vessel and handed 800 English people and 450 Italians to the French ships arriving at the scene. He then gave the order to dive. Admiral Dönitz later gave orders on September the 17th, 1942, that no German submarines should ever take steps to rescue shipwrecked people. In the meantime, the Soviet Union had also been included in the American military and finance program, Buy Now, Pay Later. More and more convoys carrying heavy war machinery and food supplies were crossing the North Atlantic to Archangelisk and Murmansk. Most of the convoys reached their destinations, where the valuable cargoes were uploaded and transported immediately to the front lines to aid the battles against German troops. In spite of strict security, German battleships continually tried to stop the flow of convoys. The 25th of September 1943 saw the Scharnhorst leave port to attack a convoy heading for Murmansk. It came to a battle around the North Cape. The German battleship could do little against the superior forces. Hit by torpedoes and shells, the ship capsized and only 36 men from a total crew of 2,000 were able to be rescued. The surface activities of the German Navy in the Atlantic came to a halt with the sinking of the most modern and powerful German battleship, Bismarck. This is one of the only colour film clips available. The sinking of the Bismarck, which took place on the 27th of May 1941 after the vessel was forced into a hopeless position by a superior force and was scuttled by the crew, hit German policies of attacking Allied sea supply lines hard. Hitler intervened and then ordered a ban on risky missions with large battleships. The Gneisenauer also took part in the war against the convoys. Badly damaged by mines and enemy fire, the ship was moved to safety in February 1942. Even though the Nazi propaganda machine played up the safe withdrawal of the battleship from endangered Brest on the French coast into safer waters, this step clearly illustrated how much the German naval forces were being pushed into a defensive role. Later, as the Gneisenauer was laid up in a Kiel shipyard, it was still attacked by British bombers and damaged on a number of occasions. Taken out of service, the Gneisenauer was finally taken to Gotenhafen for repairs. Later during the course of the war, the ship was disarmed. Germany's only aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, was also in Gotenhafen. Although it had almost been completed, work was stopped in summer of 1940. Originally, the carrier had been planned to support German battleships in the war in the Atlantic. Aircraft flying from the carrier could have done reconnaissance work and provided air cover for the warships. It was only in May 1943 that work on the completion was taken up again. The ship was ordered to Kiel, where it arrived at the beginning of December. Only a few weeks later, the final order to stop work was given and the ship was taken to Stettin. It was eventually scuttled on the 24th of April 1945 to prevent it falling into the hands of the Red Army. While the British, and above all the Americans, were building up their military capabilities at sea, the Germans were unable to comply with the so-called Z plans, which foresaw the building of 4 aircraft carriers. Another plan also came too late. This involved converting merchant ships into provisional aircraft carriers. The overall lack of raw materials put a stop to this kind of project. In the battle to sink tonnage at sea, the German High Command was forced to continue to rely on its submarines. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been the scene of bitter fighting ever since ancient times, began to increase in importance during the Second World War. As far as Britain was concerned, it was the shortest route to the Suez Canal, to the oil fields in the Middle East, and the British colonies in Southeast Asia, which were being threatened by Japan. The entry of Italy into the war saw these sea routes put in danger. Basically, both Hitler and Mussolini were agreed that Britain's power in the Mediterranean had to be broken. But Hitler was completely preoccupied with his campaign against the Soviet Union at the time and was only prepared to move German forces to the area on a limited basis. At this time, he was still banking on military support from Franco in Spain and Vichy in France. But Spain, which was in a sad economic state and was suffering from the effects of the devastating civil war, was too dependent on Britain to get involved in something like that. General Franco failed to give a clear decision to the advantage of Germany, remained neutral, and took no action against the British naval facilities in Gibraltar. Marshal Pétain also refused. An open military alliance with Germany and Italy would have caused a tough response by the French population. Britain would have reacted, and the French colonies in Africa put in serious danger. Right up to the start of the campaign on the Eastern Front, the Berlin-Rome axis could not force the British out of the Mediterranean. But there was more. Britain continued to inflict heavy damage on the Italian fleet, although it was bigger and stronger. The Italians suffered from bad leadership. British forces operating from Malta were effective against Italian sea lines with North Africa. In spite of these successes, London's position remained difficult. The situation got worse at the beginning of 1942 when the fascist Allies gained air and sea superiority in the central Mediterranean area. The British fleet suffered heavy losses. Malta experienced heavy bombing. German U-boats also sank the Ark Royal, a modern aircraft carrier off Gibraltar, and the Baham, a warship off the Libyan coast. But a few months later, the overall picture changed. Hitler was concentrating all his military power in the Soviet Union. He wanted a definite outcome on the Eastern Front. Because the Mediterranean area was only of secondary importance, there were fewer joint German-Italian sea operations. London used the situation to regain air superiority in the region and began to strengthen its fleet. The end of 1942. On the 24th of December, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted a British convoy, which was heading north from Scotland. It consisted of only 14 freighters, but had a strong defence contingent. It seemed to hint that the ships were carrying valuable war materials for the Soviet Union. Ada didn't want to lose his chance. The German Naval Command was still badly affected by results of the last large-scale naval offensive at the beginning of July. Parts of the fleet had strayed into dangerous waters and some had gone aground. Hitler had intervened personally on this occasion. The ships were ordered back and Dönitz was told to attack the convoy with his U-boats. 5 days passed and Hitler still hadn't said anything about the plans put forward by Raeder. It was only on the 30th of December, when the convoy had already reached the Barents Sea, that Hitler agreed to Operation Rainbow. Vice Admiral Kummetz left the Alta Fjord with his flagship, the fast Admiral Hipper cruiser, the slower Lutzow, and 6 destroyers. The weather was extremely bad. The storm had been raging for hours. There was fog in every direction. Sometimes the silhouette of a freighter appeared to come out of the haze, only to disappear just as quickly as it came. Finally, the German force managed to locate their enemies. Five British destroyers and smaller defensive ships lined up to protect the convoy. The battle was on. 3 hours later, Kummetz had managed to sink 2 British warships, and the Onslow, the flagship of the British destroyer flotilla, had been badly hit. Convinced of victory, the commander of the U-354 sent a radio message to naval leadership in Berlin. But the situation changed dramatically when 2 British cruisers, the Jamaica and Sheffield, suddenly showed up on the scene. A short while later, the Eckhold, a German destroyer, was sent to the bottom with its entire crew. At the same time, the Admiral Hipper was hit badly. During the course of the battle, the freighters making up the convoy were able to get into Murmansk undamaged. Kummetz was forced to give up the fight. He had had strict orders to avoid a fight with any enemy force of equal size. The security of the German warships should in no way be endangered. The entire operation had been a failure. The German vessels were ordered to observe strict radio silence on the return journey to avoid the enemy warships. Back in the Alta Fjord, radio contact was extremely difficult due to a strong blizzard. At this point, the German leadership in Berlin and in the Führer's quarters in Rastenburg were still convinced that the operation had been a resounding success. This came to a head with the publication of a report by Reuters, the British news agency. Hitler was furious and confusion reigned in Berlin. The lines of communication to Alta were still down, and radar needed days before the situation was clarified. His meeting with Hitler on the 6th of January in the so-called Wolfschanze went extremely badly. Hitler refused to listen to bad weather excuses and ordered the large vessels to be taken out of service and broken up. There were no doubts at all that Raeder was going to be relieved of his post. The Naval High Command put together an extensive paper to save their fleet, but Hitler refused to be swayed by any of it. The threatening situation on the front in Stalingrad and in North Africa meant the mobilization of all available reserves for the final showdown on the Eastern Front. On the 30th of January 1943, the anniversary of the Nazis coming to power, German radio announced that Grand Admiral Erich Raeder had been relieved of his duties at his request. The new Supreme Commander of the Naval Forces was Admiral Dönitz, who was promoted to Grand Admiral at the same time. Raeder was given the job of a General Inspector of the German Navy. All his former power had been taken from Raeder. His new post as General Inspector meant he had no influence anymore. The future of the German Navy now lay in the hands of Dönitz, who managed to retain his command over the U-boats as well. Dönitz had often recommended closer ties between the military forces and politics, and was considered a convinced follower of Hitler. Just the same, he did manage to convince Hitler that the Navy would require large surface vessels sometime and couldn't do without them. But what was the situation of the German U-boat fleet like? The majority of the submarine harbours on the French Atlantic coast had been destroyed by 1943. At the beginning of the same year, Churchill had attempted to flatten L'Oriente with the aim of blowing up the U-boats penned using 2,000 bombers. Although the town centre was destroyed and many of the population lost their lives, the pens made of concrete and steel remained unscathed. But failures like this did little to change the worsening situation faced by the German side. The Submarine Warfare Operational Center had been located in Charlottenburg in Berlin since March 1943. Dönitz kept trying to win the battles for the convoys. He had developed a new search system for reconnaissance purposes. Two groups were combing the Atlantic. They sailed on parallel courses, searched in sectors and tried to locate convoys. All this was augmented by informers in the United States who gave details of the formation of convoys, details of ships leaving harbours and their convoy protection. March 1943. 44 German submarines came across a double-sized Allied convoy consisting of 80 ships. The Grey Wolves managed to sink 21 ships for the loss of only one submarine. Although even more success was in the offering, Dönitz ordered his U-boats to break off the engagement. The majority of the crews were at the end of their tethers, and many submarines had major technical problems, clear signs of collapse being near. A few weeks later, the last few days of April had seen the German command gather its forces to attack a large convoy which had been formed south of Iceland and was proceeding in the direction of Newfoundland. It carried the code name ONS-5. There were 41 German U-boats moving in on their prey. After initial successes had been registered, the situation began to get more difficult. U-630 was sunk by a Canadian flying boat while attacking a freighter. The convoy disappeared into fog banks and contact was lost. A further 5 German submarines were located by radar by the convoy defenders and sunk. The convoy continually tried to shake off its pursuers by changing direction. The Germans, for their part, were keen to keep contact and sink the slowest merchant ships, the stragglers at least. The British Navy had set out tough regulations to prevent just this. Freighters in a convoy had to maintain a minimum speed. Ship owners are said to have used illegal tricks during tests. Safety valves were locked down, boilers had insufficient water levels, and generators were switched off so that minimum requirements were met. The reasons are clear to see. The loss of a freighter was good business for ship owners and brokers. The vessels were insured, and the loss of a cargo meant the insurers paid. The only risk was carried by the crew. Many a brave seaman paid the price for profit-hungry ship owners with his life. In the meantime, the convoy had run into bad weather. A cyclone was raging across the waters of the Atlantic. It was hopeless to try to continue the attack. Dönitz gave the order to break off the operation on the morning of the 6th of May. In spite of the submarines having sunk 12 Allied vessels, the whole affair had become a bitter defeat for the German side. 7 German U-boats were lost. The increased Allied defence led to the loss of 30 submarines in March 1943 alone. A further 70 U-boats were destroyed in the period from July to August. While US shipyards were using incredible programs to construct 2 ships for every one lost, the Germans could not balance out losses because the raw materials and personnel were not available. The end was near. January 1943 saw Roosevelt and Churchill in Casablanca, where they called on Germany to capitulate without conditions. At this time, the war on the Eastern Front had reached a decisive stage. The tragedy of Stalingrad was unavoidable. The North African campaign had been lost, and British convoys were moving almost unhindered in the Mediterranean. Then, in July 1943, Allied troops carried out a landing on the southern part of Sicily. The situation for German U-boats operating in the Atlantic became even more hopeless. Although Dönitz had more submarines than he had originally thought necessary to cut Britain off from its supplies, no success materialized. Although there were a total of 436 submarines operational in May 1943, the number of Allied ships being sunk was getting smaller. Attacks on convoys often ended in disaster, with more German submarines being destroyed than Allied merchant ships. Modern radar and automatic radio detection equipment, which could pinpoint a submarine that was sending a radio message in seconds, meant that the hunters had become the hunted. Finally, Dönitz took the consequences and ordered the remaining submarines back from the Atlantic. He explained this at the time as a temporary measure until the war could be continued with better weapons. But the technical lead held by the Allies was too great. The German Navy was now pinning its hopes on new U-boat developments and the Type XX-1 and Type XX-111 in particular. But production could only move ahead at a snail's pace due to the continual bombing raids on German towns and shipyards. There was hardly time to test new technology, and crew training was reduced to a minimum. Added to this was the fact that the German Navy's surface vessels had taken shelter in Norwegian ports to avoid the Allied air superiority and were no longer taking an operational part in the conflict. Dönitz kept insisting on speeding up the construction of modern U-boats and demanded a bigger share of the raw materials available. In vain. The only available reserves were quickly sent to the Russian front to try and stop the Red Army's advance. The technical lead enjoyed by the Allies expanded. Month after month, the numbers of German submarines lost increased. They were not able to cope with the massive attacks launched by the enemy. Not only were the submarines' capabilities to stay underwater for long periods insufficient, but their speed underwater was too slow. Above all, the Germans needed radar sets that would help the submarines survive. Although a number of new pieces of equipment with secret-sounding names like Metox, Naxos, Tunis, Gema and Hohentville were installed in the narrow confines of German conning towers, none of them were able to solve the problem. The only secure way to avoid enemy radar was to stay underwater. But only the electric motors could be used, and the board batteries were soon exhausted. They could only be charged by travelling on the surface with the diesel engine running. German scientists developed the snorkel, which was a pipe jutting out over the conning tower, which was used to draw fresh air into the vessel for the diesel engine when running underwater. But this created yet another problem. The submarine lost its ability to hear. Diesel engine sounds drowned out sonar signals from oncoming ships and even made the submarines easier to locate for the enemy. The introduction of the snorkel did not produce the required results. There were other inventions that were never put into service. There was the little helicopter called the water wagtail that was designed to locate enemy shipping. It was a simple device that was easy to get up and stow away on board. The helicopter had been designed for taking off and landing on a submarine. These rare film clips show the water wagtail undergoing tests. In the meantime, scientists were feverishly working on the military aspects of rocket technology. Using the substantial lead that Germany enjoyed in this sector, scientists were able as early as October 1943 to send the first vehicle built by human hand to the borders of space. The rocket, which carried the code name Aggregat 4, was renamed the V2 by the Nazi propaganda machine, and the plans had been laid to install one in a submarine and fire it at New York. But this technology was never put into service. Today, missiles are part of the standard arsenal of all modern atomic submarines. The concept of a radio-controlled boat full of explosive, called the Linzer, which would be steered from another ship, was later put to good use by the Israeli Navy, which drew on experience gained by the Germans and the Italians. Many submarines like the Seal and Martin, which carried a one- or two-man crew and side-mounted torpedoes, were designed to attack enemy ships. These were actually put into service. The tiny craft, which could dive to a depth of around 10 metres, saw service during the Allied invasion in Anzio and on the coast of Normandy. But in view of the huge superiority enjoyed by the Allies, this small contribution proved to be of little importance. Spring 1944. Preparations were underway on the Atlantic coast to repel any Allied invasion. Gun positions were constructed, wide minefields laid, and new units transferred to the coastal regions. The Naval High Command was convinced that their preparations would serve them well. Complicated plans had been laid months in advance for harbours and defending forces. Any ship which could not put to sea for any reason on the decisive day was to draft its crew to the infantry units to help bolster the coastal defence. As the Allied Armada, with over 1,200 ships and 4,100 landing craft, sailed towards the Normandy coast on the morning of the 6th of June, the German side could only muster 5 destroyers, 34 motor torpedo boats and 36 submarines. The Allied landing could not be prevented in spite of all attempts to repel it. The war at sea around England and France had been lost. The Tirpitz, which was a larger sister ship of the Bismarck that was sunk in action, was lying damaged in the Alta Fjord after being attacked by mini-submarines. In order to avoid any operational activities in German waters, 41 Allied bombers with support from a British aircraft carrier set out to attack the vessel. The hail of bombs damaged the Tirpitz, but could not smash through the armour-plated deck. Further attacks were unsuccessful because the Tirpitz laid down smoke screens. It was only when northern Norway had to be evacuated that the Tirpitz was moved to Tromsø. The idea was to run the ship aground and use it as a coastal battery. The 12th of November 1944, British Lancaster bombers attacked the stricken ship with special 6-ton bombs. The superstructure explodes, the port side of the vessel is twisted out of position. The ship begins to turn and threatens to capsize. All hands on deck. For the 1,204 members of the crew, this order came too late. They lose their lives in the wreck of the once mighty vessel. The last heavy German ships were moved to the Baltic Sea in August 1944. They included the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper, Admiral Scheer, Lutzow and Prinz Eugen, as well as the Leipzig and Nuremberg, 2 light cruisers. They were there to support the German units already in the Baltic area. But what was the situation like on the Eastern Front at this point? The 2 army groups, Middle and South, were slowly being forced back westward. Leningrad in the north had long been under pressure from the German forces. The Germans had managed to block the Gulf of Finland using mines and anti-submarine nets. The middle of January saw the Red Army finally drive the enemy forces out of the area between the Ladoga Lake and the city. Then on the 5th of November, units from the Baltic Fleet landed a special spearhead force consisting of 40,000 men and heavy equipment to west of Leningrad. The Soviet offensive began 10 days later under the gunfire protection of the ships lying close to the city. The Red Army then began to march along the northern coast with support from the fleet. In view of the impending defeat, the 2nd September sees Finland break off relations with Germany and calls a halt to hostilities against the Soviet Union. The sea barriers had to be maintained to prevent the Russian forces from pushing forward into the Baltic Sea. One strategic point was the retaking of the Finnish island called Suusari, but the Finns were able to repel the attacks with the aid of Russian air support. Now all the locks were open. A little while later, Revel had to be evacuated. It was on the 23rd of September that the last German convoy left the city harbour. Up until this point in time, some 50,000 German soldiers and 85,000 refugees had been taken across the Baltic Sea to safety. On the 29th of September, the Russians began with the battle for the Baltic states. A naval force including the heavy cruiser Lutzow, 2 destroyers and 5 torpedo boats were only able to hold up the Russian advance for a while. Riga fell on the 13th of October. At this point in the war, the German Navy was no longer in a position to stage independent operations. The ships that were still operational were used primarily to support German troops during the withdrawal. The German U-boat fleet had also suffered serious problems. October 1944 saw only 141 submarines in operational condition out of a total of 456. The beginning of 1945 saw the German Navy given its final task, which was to rescue the people threatened by the Red Army in East Prussia, West Prussia and Pomerania. Using all the available facilities, warships and merchant ships, the Navy managed to move over 2 million civilians across the Baltic Sea to the west. It became the biggest rescue operation in the history of mankind. The losses were incredibly high. Soviet bombers, mines and torpedoes sent many of the vessels jam-packed with wounded servicemen, women and children to the bottom of the sea. A particularly tragic event centred on the fate of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The 30th of January 1945 saw a Russian submarine, the S-13, under the command of Alexander Marinesko, fire 3 torpedoes at the vessel not far from Stolpmünde. 9,343 people lost their lives in the icy waters of the Baltic. The figure included more than 3,000 children. The number of victims was 6 times the number of people who died aboard the Titanic. The biggest maritime catastrophe of all times was all but forgotten for years, until a novel written by Günter Grass drew the public's attention to the incident again. The situation facing the Germans grew more hopeless. Each and every day brought more and more losses. The Red Army crossed the River Oder and pushed forward in the direction of Stralsund. The Americans and British bombed one German town or city after another and reduced them to rubble. Heavy raids on Kiel saw British bombers destroy the German cruisers, Admiral Hipper, Admiral Scheer and the Emden. 1 week later, the Lutzow suffered the same fate. Although Germany was finished, the 3rd of May saw the British bombers attack ships lying in Kiel Bay. One of the vessels sunk in the attack was the Cap Arcona, with 6,000 concentration camp prisoners on board. Despite frantic efforts to warn the pilots, the vessel went down and thousands of innocent people lost their lives. April 29, 1945. Hitler dictates his last political will and testament. Goering and Himmler were to be expelled from the Nazi Party. Grand Admiral Dönitz was appointed Reichspräsident and Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht. However, Dönitz disregarded Hitler's final order to destroy all military and civilian facilities that could be of use to the enemy. 3 days after Hitler commits suicide in his Berlin bunker, May 3, 1945, Dönitz issues a statement in his capacity as Supreme Commander declaring the naval bases in Kiel and Flensburg as open towns and orders them not to be defended. The final act had come. Many naval personnel fulfilled their duties until the last moment. Although the Supreme Commander had ordered that no ships should be destroyed, many U-boat crews scuttled their craft in the last days of the war. As the guns gradually grew silent, the German Navy failed to exist anymore. In the final communique issued by Wehrmacht on the 9th of May 1945, it said, "The weapons have fallen silent on all fronts since midnight. On the orders of the Grand Admiral, the Germans had stopped hostilities in a hopeless situation. 6 years of heroic fighting has come to an end. We enjoyed great victories, but also suffered serious defeats. The German armed forces have been honourably defeated in the face of superior forces.